Okay, I'm Mabel Wilson. I'm a professor of architecture at Columbia GSAP and a member of Who Builds Your Architecture.
I'm Jordan Carver. I'm currently a doctoral student at NYU, and I am also a member of Who Builds Your Architecture.
It got started like all good projects over a dinner. One of our collaborators, Kadambari Bakshi, who is a professor at Barnard in architecture, had a conversation about the Gulf Labor Coalition's petition that was asking the Guggenheim Foundation to ensure that construction workers were going to be treated fairly at the museum that they had proposed building in Abu Dhabi. And the design was by Frank Gehry. And we looked at the list of who had signed, and we sort of noticed there were no architects, and then we started to look at the architecture blogosphere and noticed there wasn't much talk about the petition. But you would think with architects implicated within what was being what was being protested, and there were New York Times articles about it, but nothing from architects. And so we wondered, well, what do architects have to say about it? And so that's how we figured out we just needed to basically pose the question back to our colleagues and ask, who builds your architecture? In order to get them to begin to think about who is it that's on the other end of that information, on the ground, actually building buildings. And so that's where it got started in spring of 2011, I believe.
I got involved about a year later, I think. I had known Mabel and Kadambari from Columbia, and was concerned and interested in these issues as well, and hopped on board.
There are at least, at any given time, five members. We've had members who started and who've left, people who worked on projects and left. But the way we've been working was, and this was the question, this is part of the reason we asked the question, because we didn't know. For us, what was really important to understand is we didn't understand that process either. And so by asking the question of others and sort of trying to figure out, well, how do we get architects to understand and know about this? We became sort of educated, and it was a process of, us sort of developing the tools to explain this to others. And so we've conducted workshops. The first things we did were public panels, simply sort of trying to get architects to come and talk about it. And that was a challenge. Our first public panel was at the Vera Liz Center for Art and Politics. And Karen Caroni, who's the director of the center, which is at the New School, Parsons, the New School, in Manhattan, was gracious enough to actually offer us the time and the resources to put together a panel, and they would advertise it. But as we started to ask people, well, would you be willing to come and sort of talk about this publicly? We got very polite no's. I'm busy, I don't know anything about this. Some people were just genuinely, I have really nothing to say about the issue. So we started to realize this is a very, very complicated question. And particularly because we were beginning to approach firms that we knew were doing work, for example, in the Middle East. This is precisely where I think a lot of the sort of more crises around workers' rights were happening. But it's a global question. People were just like, not sure I want to talk about that publicly. So we realized this was going to be a challenge to both make visible the issues, but then to also get architects to try to talk about the issues. I think the panel was the first one, was to figure out, one, who do we ask? What kinds of questions should we be asking? What is it that we don't know? And we figured out very early on that one group that was going to be extremely useful were people who were working with human rights groups. So for example, Human Rights Watch had done a number of reports on Saudi Island, which is where the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi had been proposed. Amnesty International, we started to realize, oh, there's this sort of cache of material on these issues around construction work. And there were reports on China, the exploitation of workers, and Russia, a number of reports on various places in the Middle East. Amnesty International started to do work in Qatar. And so we realized that that was going to be certainly a resource for us in terms of understanding the issues. But there were also people from Gulf Labor who had already sort of been familiar with these issues and developing their own campaigns and strategies of working. But we realized, I think, early on that they had people sign this pledge. But when we started to ask architects, well, would you do likewise? They said, no. We have not, we don't hire the construction workers. That's a completely separate contract between the contractor or the subcontractor, the crews, and the client, but that's not our purview. And that's part of the reason we realized there's this kind of firewall, of risk management between, that also meant that, architects didn't necessarily want to have much to do with that issue. And yet, architects are making decisions in offices that are also impacting what's happening on the ground in job sites. So part of it was sort of figuring out who were the people. So we did have somebody from Gulf Labor come, somebody who's an architect scholar, Peggy Deemer, who had done work on issues around labor and craft production, a colleague of ours, Fred Levrat, who was an architect who had done work in Dubai and also Afghanistan. So he sort of knew that territory as well. We had Bill Van Esvel from Human Rights Watch and Andrew Ross from Gulf Labor. So that's how we started to figure out, all right, who is it that we can start to have a conversation with about the issues? So that was a sort of strategy of sort of just talking, really.
Well, I think from the first panel up until about our first exhibition, getting a room full of people that are willing to discuss the project was itself a production. That it was a process of self-education for us and a process of really trying to find people within the architectural profession or within the university that wanted to have a very serious conversation and wanted to grapple with questions that had very complicated and not very easy answers, or that might not really have answers that we could conceive of at the time. And so just, I think, proposing those sort of events or those sort of discussions is very tricky. It's hard to ask people to participate in something where you don't really know what you're asking of them. And so that, I think was a crucial part of the first couple of years of our project, is really how do we form the language and how do we create a dialogue that allows people to come in and sit down and have these discussions. For us, the exhibition was an opportunity to visualize a lot of what we had been talking about, which meant that we had to deploy our architectural skills and deploy a means of representation on a very complex subject. And so for us, it was a chance to really look at what is a global supply chain, what is a global construction project, and draw it and create a visual language in order to describe it. And so that exhibition, it was I think we were put in the room of activist exhibitions or something like that. And it was a nice place to be in that having a way to visually lay out in a drawing form to say this is actually what the construction process is. It's not a building, it's not a diagram, it's a very serious, complex network of actors coming in and out, and materials and people and information and knowledge that's transferring all around the world. I think that was the most important part of the exhibition for me.
Yeah, and it took, it took several, meetings, and we had, at that point, we had a closed-door meeting with a group of architects. We had met one-on-one with architects. We had workshops with not just with architects. We were also we were talking about people who had been doing, for example, reporting in the Middle East. people who were labor organizers, urban planners, urban theorists. We were, sort of drawing. We had students who were interested in these issues. We were sort of drawing together people to help begin to brainstorm. So, okay, here's the problem. In what ways could the profession address this? So part of it was trying to make visible the problem. The other one was sort of trying to find strategies of beginning to address, all right, these are potential sort of solutions. And also recognizing that architects are one part of a much kind of a larger terrain of actors that actually have to transform a very large system. And there are lawyers that have to be involved, there are activists, there are the workers themselves, but architects are part of that. And architects, because of where they are within the process, do have power, actually, and do have leverage. And so it's a question of trying to begin to make that visible and what the potential was. And so for us, the exhibition was an effort to say, these are your actions. This is the problem. And yeah, we were very pleased, I think, with the outcome. I would say for us, it was a way of starting to test, again, like the legibility of the issue and how we could do it. We knew that the exhibition probably wasn't going to be the proper forum because it has a limited audience. Although the outcomes actually of the exhibition have been quite interesting, but they have more to do with local issues in Istanbul, actually, because it actually sparked a conversation in Istanbul that we're continuing with a project called Who Builds Istanbul. So there was an outcome, but also I think toward the larger issue, we started to use the ways of working and drawing and the issues we started to uncover and developed what we call a critical field guide. So it's a publication that will be available online so that people who are interested in this issue can educate themselves and learn more about it. And so sort of taking now what we've learned and what we know and actually beginning to make that more accessible and available.
Well, I think that's a good question. That one of our points of view, or one of the things we've been grappling with, is that all architectural projects are by nature, or many architectural projects are by nature, global, transnational, international projects. So there's a way in which architects working locally, as in any city building a project in their own city, have similar issues to grapple with, like these issues to grapple with an architect, say, working in Montreal or working in New York, building somewhere overseas. And so that's been important for us, that the issues translate actually quite well in different ways and in different registers. And part of the thing for us to grapple with is, what are the jurisdictions that we're dealing with? Something in Abu Dhabi or in Doha or in Istanbul are quite different than something in New York. But the question of on architecture itself as a global practice is still there. Materials can be coming from all over the world. Labor is coming from all over the world. There's still questions of migration. There's still questions of worker citizenship and exploitation and information transfer that are fairly applicable. It's not universal, but a lot of those issues can move around depending on where the architects are and where the projects are.
That's I mean, I think for all of us, it's certainly something that we think about in the other things that we do. I mean, I've sort of interested in networks. I have this other sort of experimental lab called Global Africa Lab. And part of what we do is we do data, what we call data spatialization. But it also deals with these questions of the flows of data, information, bodies, knowledge across borders, and sort of what constitutes global culture and how do you make that visible? What are the stoppages, the backups, the ways in which things move smoothly across time and space? But also, as a historian, that's modernity. I mean, that was the nature of the ways in which people were constantly moving, making contact. Things were always sort of transferring and transforming. So So I think within my own work, there are issues that are clearly connected. But I do think that, for all of us, we're all interested in other ways of working. I think we've all worked in traditional architectural practices and find that the tools of architecture and the ways of thinking in architecture can be applied in so many different and diverse ways. And a number of the groups here, have clearly influenced my own work. Brad Samuels, for example, of Situ Research was in one of our closed door conversations. So he's somebody we've talked to actually about these issues. So yeah, so there is a kind of cross-pollination of ideas, I think, about alternative practice.
I think for me that this is part of the practice. This is part of my practice, both as a researcher and writer, but as someone who uses architectural methods in what they do. And I think part of the project is, part of the appeal to me is that the project is doable, that it's not an impossible project, and that little by little, by working through exhibitions and working through events and working through publications, that the issue can start to seep into the profession, and then change can happen. And so I have to take a long view of that, but it's not impossible. And I think that for me is the joy in it, and that for me is how it's maybe different and similar to some of the other work I do. That there could be a result at the end of it, like a kind of hard and fast result, as opposed to doing historical research or doing writing that has a different register.
Yeah, initially we were only going to do that first panel. That was it. We wanted to just bring these issues forward and have a conversation, and we were going to end it there. But then there were so many things that happened along the way, just in terms of organizing that first panel, that we realized, wait a minute, there are a lot of things here that really have to be understood and explored. And so it's, we've kept it going, and it's been going, and yeah, and so I think it's, it's developed into, I think, a very interesting sort of research and advocacy project for us. So, an important one, because architects are just going to have to deal with these issues. They're not going to disappear. And so it's a question of what aspects of the profession, whether they're professional organizations or educational institutions, or what group, probably younger architects, are the ones that are going to solve the issue. So. I think that the creative process is always the exploration of the unknown, and I think that's what keeps anyone's practice, regardless of their age, fresh. And I think that if you have that curiosity about the world and also see that there are problems and things that need to be addressed, I think the tools that you learn as an architect, precisely because of the way in which they allow you to think about the spaces we inhabit and how they're made, is an incredibly powerful tool. And so, I would just say keep a critical eye and a healthy curiosity would be my advice. Yeah, and it doesn't take much in order to kind of do work of this kind, in a way. It just takes good collaborators.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think that that the toolbox that architects carry around is very robust, and it's very rich in terms of what it can be deployed to do. And so I don't have the chance to offer my advice to young architects very often, but maybe that would be it.
Well, I think one immediate outcome of our first panel was Peggy Deemer, who was on the panel, kept bringing up the point was, sure, this is a really important conversation about architects working abroad and labor issues, but fundamentally architects don't even understand the labor and how it operates in their own offices. And she's bringing up the issue of unpaid internships, and and she said there's a labor issue in general within how the profession understands its own work. And out of that, she started something called the Architecture Lobby, and which has grown into, I think now, a worldwide organization. But that was one thing that was kind of spawned from the initial conversations that we've had with that. And then Peggy did a book on sort of labor, you know, architectural and capitalism and thinking about these labor issues. Specifically, for example, Eva Frank of Storefront was also interested in these issues, and as part of the American Pavilion in the Venice Biennial, they sponsored a day called Labor Lead, sort of thinking about, again, these labor issues and, you know, what could a lead for labor be? And so I think the conversation has definitely spawned, I think, interesting and innovative outcomes. Yeah.
We have our guidebook that is coming out of, partly out of Istanbul, but is a kind of compilation of our research of the past couple of years. That is going to be available imminently within the next, hopefully, few weeks. We have workshops in Istanbul. We have, what else do we have?
An exhibition coming up in Chicago as well. That'll be a sort of compilation of the work we've been doing, but also a project called Who Builds Chicago. So just sort of try to bring sort of these issues locally as well. So, but we're hoping the field guide, you know, once we get it out, we can start to target different people, groups, organizations to sort of institute, you know, it'd be great if the AIA took it on, or the RIBA, or the UIA. I mean, that they recognize that this issue isn't going to go away. And it's already dogged some fairly well-known architects. And so to start to develop positions on it long-term would be our goal. We don't realize we're going to do this ourselves, but we want to, you know, sort of spawn an understanding and stimulate a conversation about it.
Well, we've always thought of our project as practice. And so along with the projects of this exhibition, this is the architectural practice, that within the history and tradition of architecture, there is plenty of room for things that are outside of maybe a common understanding of what architecture is and what architecture does. And I think we fully believe that that's where we exist, kind of within the profession, but hoping to change it a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I could see why we were asked to come, because it is a kind of alternative way of using architectural methods in a form of research, and that's essentially what we've been doing. And part of it is to use it not only to look at things in the world, but actually we're turning it back onto architecture itself. So part of what we've been trying to just understand is, what is transnational architectural practice? And how does this fit into what we keep calling the global supply chain of the construction industry? That includes all the materials, the workers, the contractors, the clients, the financing. I mean, that's now, it's a huge, huge, huge entity. It's political, it's economic, it's uneven, it's messy, it's violent. And so I think, you know, that there are things certainly with the work of forensic architecture that we have some affinities to. Also, I love the global tools, because we were thinking globally. And so I think there are things in this room that are certainly allied, I think, with some of the things about fabrication, production, construction that we're talking about.